Welcome to Carbon Conversations, a podcast by Biochar Life, where we explore the cutting edge of environmental solutions, from biochar to smart agriculture to the climate tech revolution. We sit down with experts and business leaders at the forefront of change. This is your host, Matt Rickard. Hey Mike, good morning. Well, good afternoon probably, is it? What is it, lunchtime there in Sydney? How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm well, thanks, Matt. Yeah, it is afternoon, 1:30. So yeah, but good morning to you.
Cool. And you're in north of Sydney, right? North of Sydney, Wollongong.
Well, today I'm coming to you live from our little music art studio at home in Wollongong.
Cool.
But our office is based up in Sydney.
Cool. The Gong. I do remember it. I was in Sydney for 10 years. It's been a while. So
yeah.
Beautiful part of the world. And
You're
in height of summer now. So anyway, we made this happen. I know we've had a bit of back and forth. We chatted before and yeah, I'm glad we managed to get on. We've both been busy. But before I jump into any questions or topics, maybe just to start off, a bit of an intro on what you do. I mean, looking at your career, you've been in the environmental sustainability space pretty much since the beginning and since you got out there, kind of employment-wise, from what I can see on your LinkedIn. But so I don't do you a disservice, maybe a bit of an intro, what you do now, what your role is and stuff. So
yeah, okay, sure. Yeah, so my role now is so I'm with Burson, who are like a global communications agency. Within Burson, we have a specialist sustainability service called Sustainability and Social Impact. And I lead that for the APAC market. And the reason that we have that is mainly, I guess, a few reasons. Obviously, sustainability is BAU now for companies, and you can't have a reputation if you're not really addressing your environmental and social issues in a kind of credible manner. And also, how you communicate that is, and we'll probably talk more on this about how difficult actually that is to get right in today's landscape. So that's where I am now. But yeah, like you said, have had a pretty varied career, always within that environmental sustainability space, environmental science degree, science communication, postgrad, and then really kind of all shapes and sizes. Started off in local government doing environmental education with community, then kind of moved into more of that project space around kind of solar installs and energy efficiency projects, across council buildings, and then went into the kind of the built environment, helping companies that had large portfolios of commercial offices, industrial sites, kind of improve their energy, water, waste. And then went into that really kind of technical carbon accounting landscape of kind of measuring footprints and life cycle assessments and building net zero roadmaps and science-based targets, and all that sort of really technical piece. And then have moved, kind of taken all of that into now this world where, have that technical expertise, but really helping companies actually take the hard stuff and make it make sense, to different stakeholders. Yeah, and it's really interesting now because all that stuff that I studied in my environmental science degree around nature and ecosystems, it's like it's finally caught into the corporate world. Like, oh, actually, we need to think about our ecosystem, our impact on nature, and how do we value that? So it's quite interesting, like all of that. I feel like I've kind of come full circle in a way.
Cool, yeah, we haven't met before, but we may have crossed paths. We were certainly in the same circles. I was in Australia with Invisi. I mean, going back 10, 12 years ago, maybe. But yeah, I'm sure we're probably in the same circles. So, I mean, looking at communication, it's interesting. If I go back, like I say, if I go back 10, 12 years, there was a real hunger, it seemed to me, for the businesses that were focused on sustainability to be communicating that, whereas now it seems, and certainly with the work I do now, like I can name the customers on one hand that we sell to that will talk publicly about the investment in our programs, which seems crazy to me. What is this? This kind of, is this because of a fear of greenwashing not fear of greenwashing, but fear of being seen to be greenwashing? Because the moment you're communicating what you're doing, there is scrutiny of what you're doing. And Yeah, I mean, look, there's a lot in there, but this is what I'd really like to unpack
Yeah.
with you, because I'm assuming this is probably what you're dealing with on the front line with clients every day, is how do they, this thin line between communicating what you're doing sustainability wise, or just not communicating it and doing it because it's the right thing,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's become a really loaded, I guess, space, and I think that is for a few reasons. You know, like you said, like a lot of the time, companies, I think, when we think of what came out of the Paris Agreement and this kind of excitement and push for net zero, and this essentially this kind of global alignment on what we need to do, and having a target, and being really excited about a kind of a North Star that everyone was aiming towards. And I think, obviously from that, there was a lot of really great momentum from that kind of corporate landscape to go, okay, right, well, we're going to be setting net zero targets, and we're going to be coming out with that announcement. And it kind of created this landscape of, essentially that kind of, when we talk about that diffusion of innovation chart, where you've got like the innovators, the early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, etc. So we kind of saw that with the kind of setting that net zero target, of that kind of shift, right, of innovators through to this kind of early majority, where then suddenly, if you didn't have a net zero target, there was this kind of risk of, oh no, we're not kind of keeping up with the market, we better get out there and get one. I think in a lot of ways, like, whilst good intentions, and sometimes we refer to it as green wishing, where companies are setting these targets and talking about these things, and they're not necessarily out there to greenwash and to be deceptive on purpose. But I think in a lot of that instance, we kind of got to that point of having these targets, but not necessarily having the kind of the roadmaps to back them up. And I think in a lot of ways, there's a lot of easy, low-hanging fruit that companies could do. So, they could, invest in renewable energy through PPAs or whatever. Like, there was still some easy wins for them on the board. But, kind of fast forward 10 years on, and we really are kind of past the announcements, past the easy wins, and generally speaking, there are, there's so many, I guess, competing variables that play into this conversation, but generally we haven't moved fast enough, right? And I think there's generally a loss in trust, and there's a loss in trust from the customers to business. There's a loss in trust from businesses in terms of governments not really kind of giving them the frameworks that they need to operate in, and so there's points of frustration along that kind of societal structure. We had to say, so we haven't moved fast enough. At the same time, we have this, it's a really complicated conversation. There's a pushback on ESG as this kind of woke agenda, and, like, we only have to see how that plays out in the US in a lot of ways. But that also kind of rears its head in APAC in different ways. They're not necessarily woke, but is it this, new form of Western imperialism where we come in with these ESG frameworks and standards and agendas, and we kind of push them onto, different markets, and whether they're fit for purpose, and local markets, especially in that kind of emerging and developing space, they have so many other competing priorities.
Yeah.
It's not just climate, for example. It's, they have to think about energy, equity and energy kind of accessibility, and we need to think about social standards and all these other kind of competing sustainable development goals. And it's easy to say that obviously climate conflates all of those, and so by addressing that, we support it. But I think in a lot of markets, it's kind of like everything everywhere all at once. What do we focus on? How do we prioritize things? And so, when we talk about sustainability, in some ways, in a weird way, it's maybe seen as this kind of upper echelon thing.
Yep.
That doesn't really tap into the kind of the psyche of certain, markets and the communities that are living within those. And so it's a really kind of complex landscape in terms of how do you tap into it in a way that resonates with a certain stakeholder in a certain market. You can't just come in with, climate and kind of existential crisis because sometimes that, doesn't necessarily land or work.
How I mean, you kind of opened up the question there as a caveat, but you're working with global brands, presumably. But what you're doing, you're not just. I mean, I know you travel around. Or are you APAC based? Are you kind of working globally? What you do?
Yeah, my remit is APAC, but we have a global team, so we're often all kind of supporting one another and different clients. And like you say, we have a lot of clients that are multinational and tap into different kind of global markets.
So just before I ask that question, I want to ask, I mean, how does that? What is the nuance there? I mean, if you're talking to, even if we look at APAC wide client, the way things are communicated, say here in Thailand, or maybe Singapore's a better example versus Australia. I mean, you presumably have to look at, who are the stakeholders for that brand? Who are their customers? I mean, do you kind of have to tailor communications across a region based on the end client, based on their end customer? I mean, is there a difference between the messaging per country, literally, with this stuff?
There absolutely is. Like, I'll give you a really good example. Is if we were kind of framing up, how do we talk about, because again, let's touch on, nature risk or climate risk, and it has a financial risk to businesses, right? Like if you have ecosystem collapse and supply chains, like obviously that, and everyone kind of knows that. If you were to talk about climate and nature at the forefront, let's just say for a US market, for a specific stakeholder, you might not necessarily get that engagement and that kind of buy-in from that market. Whereas if you were to kind of put that at the front and center in a market in APAC that really get it, and in a lot of ways, a lot of APAC markets are the kind of the hub for global manufacturing and have that kind of biodiversity and that ecosystem, really at the fore for them. And that's a really important thing. And it also taps into kind of communities and social justice and, access to clean water, et cetera. So those it really taps into those markets. So if you were to frame, like, you have the same goal and you have you're kind of working towards the same goal in different markets, but in the US, you might focus more on kind of putting to the forefront of around kind of business resilience and continuity and really kind of lean into those elements.
Yeah.
And like the underwriting of that is the issues of climate and nature, et cetera. But you're really more focusing on that continuity of business and the ability to kind of de-risk and kind of looking towards that, future projection. In APAC markets, you obviously have that resilience piece, but you're very much kind of driving home the risks to climate and the risks and the impacts on nature, because that taps into very much a kind of a broader stakeholder in those markets.
You use these words climate and nature quite a bit. It's interesting to me because I think if we'd have spoke 10 years ago, we'd just be using the word climate. I might be wrong, but certainly it feels to me that the word nature is now the kind of new word. Biodiversity, is a growing space. What is that shift that's happening? What, from a business point of view, when you're talking to a business about they communicate their environmental goals, is nature becoming a bigger focus? I mean, look, it's all interlinked anyway. All these things are interlinked, right? But talk to us a bit about, the climate versus nature messaging for what a business is doing in terms of their sustainability planning.
Yeah, and that's why I said at the start, it's really interesting now that we've kind of all these kind of ecosystem-based, like science that I was studying in my degree many moons ago. I'm having these conversations now in the corporate landscape. I mean, to me personally, it seems madness that hasn't been the priority, and we've focused on climate and this. When we think about greenhouse gas emissions and gases in the atmosphere and trapping heat, and it's a very hard thing to really kind of conceptualize. But it does have this nice metric, when we talk about tons of CO2 per, so it has a nice metric that businesses can measure against and essentially put a dollar value against. So I understand that. But really, when we think about it from a really practical perspective, megaliters of water that we're using, or, like square meters of land that we're clearing, these sorts of natural capital metrics probably make a lot more sense for businesses to really kind of be measuring against. But yeah, sorry, to go to your question, I think that, like, I feel like we're at a point now with climate that, more or less businesses understand the concept, right? Okay, we've got to measure our footprint, scope 3. Okay, we've got to think about downstream and upstream. And now we're getting our heads around climate risk. What does that look like from a physical perspective? Okay, we might have some stranded assets, and, we can kind of think about measuring that. And transitional risks, okay, regulatory and okay, the market's moving, and we're even starting, and finally we're getting to that point of value creation. All right, let's not just think of it from a risk perspective, but actually what are the kind of financial opportunities that come with climate? How can we create new products? How can we move ahead of the market? That sort of, we're getting to that point slowly but surely. Nature, I think we're still very much in that risk perspective, like, okay, right, how do I actually quantify the risk of nature, and how do I put a financial dollar to that? And it's obviously harder for those companies that have complex supply chains and don't necessarily have kind of control of that, and so I still think we're very much at the process of putting nature on the balance sheet. But I think it's real. Personally, I'm really excited by where we are at and the opportunity. And again, like, you're in this space and you know better than me, but I see so much value in carbon markets. And again, I think carbon is just one layer of value that a carbon project can have. Especially when we're thinking about forestry and reforestation and ecosystem protection. If we're able to start really putting the true dollar value on protection of ecosystems and land and water and air quality and soil health, and I think like that is a really exciting. We're at a really exciting kind of juncture with that, I think, in finally being able to actually put some value on these things.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think carbon is probably slightly easier. These other, like, this is where biodiversity is fascinating. I think if you can really kind of, unfortunately, everything does, when you're talking to businesses, at some point, everything's going to come back to, economic value of how to communicate that, either negative or positive, what the impact is. So I think it's interesting as we start to be able to calculate those things. In terms of, just kind of practical guidance when you're talking to a business, how they communicate. I mean, going back to the first question around, the kind of fear of greenwashing. I mean, the fear of being perceived to be greenwashing when you're marketing. What is kind of the practical guidance around communicating sustainability clearly, confidently, responsibly, so the market understands what your real message is?
Yeah, I think it's actually, I do think it is quite simple. In a lot of ways, like, being with Burson, like we kind of push this kind of creativity in messaging, right? And so, again, it's like, can we still be creative while still being authentic and credible? And we think about, well, how do we do that? How do we create a message that is going to resonate, but is real and credible? And I think, we deal with a lot of companies that are in that kind of listed or, getting pressure from investors to report via, whether it's a mandatory reporting framework within the country or whether it's one of those, like an ISSB standard, that sort of thing. But if you look at all of those standards, like the IFRS S1, S2, if you look at, the Hong Kong EX, like they're all pulling from the same, essentially, database. But if you look at what they say in those disclosure requirements, it's okay to get it wrong, essentially. And really what you need to do is just be transparent about what the data that you've got and the quality of the data and the decisions and the assumptions that you're making off of that information. And it's okay to have a target. It's okay to not hit that target. And it's okay to actually even, go back and retrospectively improve on data which may change a future target, as long as you are making that really easy for the end user to understand. And I think the same thing applies whether you're doing it from a regulatory perspective, which is, very in-depth and dry and complicated, and, or whether you are doing it from a kind of an external brand engagement with your customers or with the market kind of perspective, is like acknowledging the good and the bad. And I think it's really important, like I say this to all of our clients and anyone I'm speaking to, it's really important to remain ambitious. It is just as negative. It is just it's just as impactful to your business to walk targets back or to not talk about them than it is to greenwash, to purposely mislead your stakeholders. And I think the sweet spot in between that is to go, right, like, this is what we want to achieve, right? And this is, our plan to get there. This is what we're doing, and if something comes up along the way, if we don't hit that target, these are the reasons why, we didn't hit that target. Because everything is dynamic. Everything changes, new information, a slowdown in the market that is outside of your control, whatever the reasons and issues may be, I think it's actually a pretty simple concept of really just being a strong communicator and being like, listen, this is what we're doing, this is how we're doing it, and this is the data that we're basing it off. And if something changes, we'll communicate that too. And just how that comes out to different stakeholders, will just look different, based on who they are.
I think that's really important. I mean, I think those points on being able to talk about what you've done and maybe, reel things back and say, hey, we didn't do that. I mean, this is the most important part of this, right? Just having integrity around the communications, regardless of whether, I think there was a fear some time ago, people just, even saying, hey, we didn't hit this target, which is nuts. Was it Patagonia's report? I saw a lot online.
Yeah.
I think it was Patagonia that, again, they've been probably, they're up there as one of the most, I would say, integral organizations. And I saw a lot of negativity around some announcements they made a few months ago. And then I saw a lot of them rebuttals with your attitude there of, hey, this is not a bad thing. This is just about saying, hey, we wanted to do this. I don't know the details of the report, but I was thinking about it as you were saying that. So, I gather from that. But anyway, go on. You probably know about it more than me, but.
Yeah, no, I think it was, if you're in that space, it was probably all over everyone's kind of LinkedIn feed, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, and like you, I saw some negative, but I saw a lot of, counter narratives to that, to be like, actually, no, like this is exactly the sort of reporting we need. And when we think about even just the term net zero has become so ideologically charged, like people have forgotten the science behind what it means. Like, what does net zero by 2050 actually mean? Actually, there's a lot of science behind that. And it kind of gives you this trajectory and kind of rate of trajectory, that you need to hit. But it's really important, I think, to, I think that kind of lack of trust that's in the market is that, if people feel like they're being kind of had in a lot of way, the blanket pulled over their eyes in a lot of senses. And I think, it's really important at this point in time for businesses to not walk back and going to that communications element. And this is what we do a lot of work with our clients, is that, there's this fear of, oh, well, what we're doing from a sustainability perspective, does that kind of, how do we prove to our stakeholders that it's something that we should be doing, and and it's not something that it's just kind of a way to improve our brand recognition. And a lot of the times we do these workshops to go, well, what's really important is we just need to ensure that we align your sustainability objectives to your business objectives.
Yeah.
So it doesn't feel like this thing that you're doing over here, and you're running your business over on this side. Actually, how your business operates and functions is reliant on these kind of sustainability objectives as well, because these objectives are also kind of tied to your resilience as a business and your profitability into the future.
On that point, I mean, I wanted to ask you a little bit about carbon offsets, credits, removal credits. One of the biggest challenges we have, is that, like I said at the very beginning, I think probably 80, if not 90% of the customers that buy or, our credits that ultimately are investing in our farmers to make biochar, to improve pollution issues. Yeah, carbon removal is part of it. Net zero planning for business is part of it. There's a whole load of other things. But the lack of marketing and announcements around that is stunning, which makes it really challenging for us. Have you seen that? Do you have any insight? I'm interested just to know, when you're, a businesses that make those investments just want to make them and it's part of their sustainability strategy, and in many cases they see more risk than value in making announcements, or I don't know if it's something you've come across, but for me it's interesting because we see it, or we see the lack of it in terms of announcements around investments in credits and removal credits.
No doubt I've seen that shift in real time, even kind of like 5 years ago, maybe even less. It was very much okay, what project are we investing in? What does it do? And like, can we get some marketing material for it so that we can talk about it? It was it was a really strong kind of like, sense of pride in that investment and what it was doing, and it was what it was achieving, and the co-benefit piece, right? That kind of co-benefits of the project and the broader kind of UN SDGs that project was working towards addressing. And then this kind of, and it, really, like, I'm definitely on the side of the coin where I see like carbon markets are such a vital form of climate finance in so many ways, to increase, nature-based solutions, to protect the ecosystems that we have, to be able to improve the soil, to be able to incentivize solar or, renewable energy versus thermal coal, or, if you don't get that kind of return on investment, then you may look to other projects. So I think, carbon markets are such a vital piece of that climate finance puzzle. But, unfortunately, those kind of, a few kind of negative projects or media from projects that were also potentially misinterpreted sometimes, you saw that kind of shift in the narrative. And I guess businesses are always trying to balance that. Like, when we think of the carbon hierarchy, they have to demonstrate avoidance, reduction, like as primary things. And so if you're at this point where you're kind of, if it's perceived that you're relying on this kind of carbon credits, then, they've got to manage that perception, But I think it's that, like, that really important, where you need that really strong communication to say, hey, we are, like, this is our journey of kind of hitting our target. But year on year, we also think it's worthwhile to think beyond our value chain and think beyond our own four walls. And yes, this helps us kind of to achieve, whether it's a carbon neutral target each year, or maybe they don't want to even claim a carbon neutral target. They just want to say, listen, we are thinking beyond our own four walls and investing in this project because it is going to be able to enable X, Y, and Z and accelerate X, Y, and Z. I think it's, the SBTI talk about it, like this BCVM, BVCM, beyond value chain mitigation. I mean, I think it's just like a really complicated way of saying, like, we have a social license as a business, to operate, and, investing in projects like this, we need to acknowledge that we are kind of a connected ecosystem, and this kind of supports that value chain, beyond the value chain kind of impact. I don't know if I answered your question, but yes, like, essentially, we see a lot of businesses kind of struggle with how do they talk about this. But I think on the upside, and maybe you haven't noticed it, but I think since Article 6 is kind of been finalised, and a lot of work has been done on kind of tightening the claims codes, like you've got the VCMI claims code, and now you've got this ability to transfer projects between countries now that Article 6 has been finalised. I think, and again, you would have better insight to this, but I think we will see a strong acceleration of the carbon markets again, which I think is really important and really exciting. And I think businesses will jump on board, once they see the kind of the reconnection and I suppose the acceptance of carbon markets as part of the puzzle.
Yeah, it makes sense. You did answer my question, and actually, to be honest, as you were talking, you just kind of gave me a couple of insights there that I was thinking of when I look at our customers, and I look at the people talking about targets typically are the industry people, but when I look at the customers that we have that do talk about the investments, actually what they talk about is co-benefits and investment back into nature and all these other pieces. So yeah, I mean, maybe that's the kind of pivot really in terms of what you communicate. Because you start talking about Article 6, and you start talking about these things, then the customer and Joe Blogs on the street doesn't know what you're talking about anyway. So
don't care about that. No, exactly. And I think as kind of the role of nature grows, again, I guess that kind of carbon market will grow as well to, we probably won't be calling it a carbon market, we'll be calling it a nature, well, I think what does Australia call it, nature repair market. We'll have these kind of, markets that exist alongside or layer on top of carbon markets that, as corporates start to measure their impacts on nature and have metrics and have targets on these, again, I think that kind of the ability, to be able to invest in natural capital, in the areas that they kind of have those operations, hopefully that will kind of be able to ramp it up as well.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, we're in the biochar space, and I see that word biochar and just the talk around that. It's becoming a bit of a buzz marketing. It's for good reason, has a lot of good. But I think talking about biochar is as a product and as a solution is something that's becoming more and more marketable. So, I didn't have any more questions. If there was anything I didn't ask, then please feel free to share. Otherwise, also, love to share your details where people can learn more, get in contact if they want to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that would be great. I always love to talk about this. I feel like I could talk about carbon markets and nature for 24 hours. I don't think it'd be a successful podcast. But no, I don't have any more kind of questions. It's been a really interesting conversation. Thank you.
Cool. Where can people get in contact or follow you online? I mean, do you want to point them to LinkedIn if there's anyone wanting to learn more about what you do or the organization? So.
Yeah, listen, I think probably LinkedIn is the easiest place to find me. Would you like me to? I've got a very complicated last name.
That's cool.
I can't just say no one's going to find it.
Mike, I'll put it in the speaker notes so for anyone watching or listening, they can read more about you and your profile, and I'll make sure there's links in there for people to follow or get in contact if they want to. But look, I appreciate you taking some time out during your day, and hopefully we'll cross paths at some point, in person. So
yeah, that'd be great. Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, man.
Cool. Cheers.
All right. See you.